Happy New Year's. The Black Divinity Association, NAACP, NAACA, the National Association for Fair Access, Anti-Profiling, Culture, and Awareness, Ankh Uja Senev Ministries, which means Life, Prosperity, and Health Ministries, along with the Environmental Justice Stakeholders Cultural Collaborations, presents Humanitarian Contributions 101, theme, Steps of Peacemaking and Healing, January the 17th, 2021, by delayed virtual viewer. This humbling gathering has been brought about to acknowledge the meaningful contributions made by individuals that lives reflect these actions towards the community and humanity in general. Our continuing title is Humanitarian Contributions 2021, and our theme, as I have referenced, is Steps of Healing and Peacemaking. And as I said, January the 17th, 2021, via delayed virtual viewer, with respect to COVID-19 and these very humbling times. The designated honorees are as follows: Mother CALLIE, FRIERSON Jordan, humanitarian, root person, and healer. Sergeant George Washington Brown, humanitarian, businessman, entertainer, community organizer, ALVIN $1 Million Baby Prouder, humanitarian, former multiple championship belt world title holder, actor and karate tournament. The classical publication by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, entitled A Narrative of the Proceedings of the Black People During the Late Awful Calamity in Philadelphia in the year 1793, and a refutation of some censiress thrown upon then in some late publications. And Mr. Charles Chuck Box, humanitarian, former advisor to the Builders Club at Joe Cook Junior High School in Columbus, Mississippi, worker at the YMCA, community organizer. This is being brought forth in conjunction with the International Ethiopian Cultural Celebration of Timket and the 2021 edition of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Again, this is being brought forth collaboratively by the following: NAACP, NAACA, National Association for Fair Access, Anti-Profiling, Culture, and Awareness, Black Divinity Association, Ankh Uja Senev Ministries, and the Environmental Justice Stakeholders Cultural Collaboration. Now, let me give you a little bit about the different participants of the honorees and give you a little information about them. Sergeant George Washington Brown, or known as Sweet Georgia Brown, businessman, cleaners, photographer, DJ, and leader and guitar player, humanitarian, and skater, community organizer, worked towards healing and peacemaking, though being raised by his aunt, the late Mrs. Easter Harris, root lady and healer, after his mother's early death while he was an infant. Mr. George Washington Brown worked closely with the humanitarian efforts with the likes of the late Dr. Theodore Roosevelt Mason Howard of Mount BAYOU during the 1940s and 1950s, and the Reverend George Washington Lee, formerly of BELZONI, Mississippi. Mr. Brown was a sergeant in the U.S. Army and was called by many of his associates as the original Sweet Georgia Brown. His efforts through very humbling times predated the legendary careers of the late Don Cornelius, B.B. King, and even an earlier atmosphere before the later movie called Harlem Nights. But with an earlier Mississippi twist, some of his DJ efforts and band efforts were held through places like Mount BAYOU at Dr. Howard's place on Ferry Street in Jackson, Mississippi, and in BELZONI, Mississippi, with the likes of greats like Sonny Boy Williams II. Mr. George Washington Brown also continued his humanitarian contributions despite the systemic racism of his time, as within his involvement with church activities within his community, even when asked not to travel in certain areas. Mr. Brown was a resident of Columbus, Mississippi. Also, this year we are doing something different. We are doing a very well thought of one of the earliest publications entitled A Narrative of the Proceedings of the Black People During the Late Awful Calamity in Philadelphia in the year 1793, and a refutation of some censorists thrown upon then in some late publication by Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. This is one of the earliest publications that speaks to actual steps of peacemaking and healing made by black people in U.S. history, that was published by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. The two men were given their account of the then yellow fever epidemic, which was reported as being a national epidemic. Dr. William Curry had published a very false and misleading account of blacks' involvement with the yellow fever epidemic and humanitarian efforts. Allen and Jones gave their report of how black people were risking their lives to help individuals who were impacted at that time. They and other individuals from the black community, like the black nurses and other members of the Free African Society, labored, bled, sweat, shed tears, and many even died as these honorable steps of healing and peacemaking were utilized. For these referenced humanitarian efforts that took place in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, at or about 1793, it was so intense that the U.S. Capitol is believed to have moved to its present location. Therefore, this publication by Allen and Jones gives one of the greatest accounts of the humanitarian efforts of how black people were very resourceful at that particular time during the national yellow fever epidemic. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones would later help found the Connectional African Methodist Episcopal Church that would internationally grow to have memberships in 20 Episcopal districts in 39 countries on 5 continents, with schools and learning centers worldwide. The next honoree is that of the late Mother Callie Frierson Jordan, or Mama Callie as she is effectively called. Born in the area typically known as the Dancy Plantation in Alabama at or about Sumner, Alabama, not far from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and a few miles outside of Columbus, Mississippi, according to her daughter, the late Mrs. Susie Willie Jordan Brewer. She was the last child born to Mrs. Emily and Abe Frierson. Mother Callie Frierson Jordan, being the 13th child and the only girl, according to her daughter, she had at or about 12 brothers. She was descendants of the native blacks along the Red Tail Black Creek Indians. Family legendary history indicate that her family was genuinely impacted by the systemic racism and policies of her time, but she adjusted and continued through her existence from at or about 1853 through 1963. Fact-finding has even been suggested that she could have been born as early as 1849. Her darling mother, Emily, is reported to have been born in Mississippi at or about 1825. Furthermore, Her grandparents coexisted before Mississippi and Alabama claimed statehood in December the 10th, 1817 and December the 14th, 1819, respectively. Civilized cultural information shows that genuine steps of peacemaking and healing continued throughout her family's history for some time, even up to the present. Some of the policies and specific times confronted leading up to Mama Kelly's coexistence and survival adjustment were as follows. The formation of the states of Mississippi and Alabama in 1817 and 1819 as referenced, the Indian Removal Acts, and later Trail of Tears and Treaty of Cusseta of 1832. Her family was scattered to areas like the later Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood District, throughout places like West Point, Mississippi, and Columbus, Mississippi, where her residence was until her passing at or about 110 years old, where she was raising her granddaughter and helping with other youth. One of the youth will go on to be an interim president of an HBCU, historical black college and university. He would also be a scientist and was acknowledged by the U.S. White House. Mama Kelly would take residence at the geographical location in Columbus, Mississippi. She would marry the legendary Andrew Jordan, and they would have one child, Mrs. Susie Willie Jordan. After her husband's passing, Mama Kelly would continue her healing and peacemaking efforts in spite of the challenges of systemic racism of her time. She lived at her residence, among other blacks, on land which is presently Mississippi University for Women in Columbus, Mississippi. She was also the honorable mother of the church at Turner's Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church during its humble evolvement. The photo of Mama Kelly sitting on the natural ground with her little girl Susie in Columbus, Mississippi has graced the cover of at least 3 publications. These reference publications are as follows. 1. Cultural Environment 101, A Plan for a Master Plan. Number 2, The Melanin Resurrection Glue Workbook. And number 3, An Observation on the Issue of White Flight, a Cultural Commentary. Mama Kelly is also referenced in the original YouTube publication entitled Red Tail Trail, Parts 1 through 4. Please allow us to be thankful for the works of these individuals. The next one is none other than Alvin, the $1 Million Baby Prouder, humanitarian with an international presence, medical miracle, one of the first multiple world title holders in more than one division at the same time, winner of multiple point karate sparring tournaments internationally and nationally, actor on the nationally acclaimed sitcom The White Shadow with actors like Ken Howard. World Champion Prouder had an immensely impact on many people, including the Reverend VINSON Ballard and many people from Columbus, Mississippi and Mississippi alike. As you can see, these are some very, very hardworking persons. Now, last but not least, let me show respect to one of our honorees, and Mr. Charles Chuck Box. Mr. Box was a very help to my life. He was one of the advisors to the Builders Club at Joe Cook Junior High School in Columbus, Mississippi, during or about 1979 through 1980. Mr. Box also was a worker and a volunteer for the YMCA, and he also is a retired worker in the corporate sector, a good family man. Let us pay tribute to this very humanitarian service, Mr. Charles Chuck Box. And so, as you could see, these 2021 honorees are some very, very, very good reminders of how important it is to take part in steps of peacemaking and humanitarian. But it also reminds us of how necessary it is to sometimes look outside of the box and go outside of the box as it relates to the mainstream educational textbooks. Like, for example, Sergeant George Washington Brown from Columbus, Mississippi, who was very much involved in many of the humanitarian efforts during the 1940s and the 1950s, with Dr. Theodore Roosevelt Mason Howard, another one of our honorees who was a medical doctor and a physician from Mount BAYOU, Mississippi. He was a business person. He was over hospitals, and he was very instrumental in some of his understudies or students, such as Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, Mr. MEDGAR Evers, Dr. Ida Mae Holland, Reverend Blue, and others. And he worked very closely with people like Sergeant George Washington Brown. Dr. Howard also was very instrumental in the aftermath of the Emmett Till investigation, where Emmett Till's mother, Mamie, and some of the witnesses are reported to have stayed on the property of Dr. Howard. Dr. Howard would host some of the biggest entertainment shows where Dr. George Washington Brown was the DJ and the band leader, as well as other people. And also, he was a very, very, very serious humanitarian into peacemaking and humanitarian efforts. Also, let us not forget the Reverend George Washington Lee of BELZONI, Mississippi. Facts say that he was born in Edwards, Mississippi. He was a business person, a minister, and he was over the NAACP in BELZONI, Mississippi. And he was also the vice president of Dr. Howard's organization that predated SCLC and many of the civil rights ever. Reverend George Washington Lee was assassinated in May of 1955 in BELZONI, Mississippi. And he was very much involved with the works of peacemaking and healings during that time. And so we certainly pause to pay tribute to Dr. Theodore Roosevelt Mason Howard of Mount Bayou, as well as the late, great Reverend George Washington Lee, who was protégés of Sergeant George Washington Brown of Columbus, Mississippi, and they worked very close together. And so, as you see, as we bring it to a close of this edition of Humanitarian Contributions 101, with the theme of Steps of Peacemaking and Healing, these individuals, as well as this book, we think are very fitting. Let me pause to thank all of those that have been very instrumental in the fact-finding information. Let me thank the board members. Let me thank those of you who has went outside of the box to provide this information. I hope that this is something that we can build on. I hope that it is something that we can love ye one another closer, and we work towards bringing peacemaking and healing to our community. Please allow me to thank the organizations that have made this available. We are certainly praying for everybody during these very humbling times. But let me thank you for this delayed virtual edition of Humanitarian Contributions 101, theme, Steps of Peacemaking and Healing. You be blessed.